So good morning, everyone. This is our second installment. Again, we are SRG Commercial Real Estate. Quick recap of who we are, what we do. So this is our third year in commercial real estate. All we do is commercial. And our last class was talking about commercial as a whole and different segments of it, what class qualifies as commercial. Now, the first question that we typically get is, what do we do once we have a commercial property? And that's what this class is about. We'd like to go into the LOI, the art of the LOI, which is the major negotiating factor. So my name is Khalid, by the way. This is Ahmad. We've lifelong friends and business partners.
Yeah. So today, just to recap, so it'll be about the LOI, and we're going to end the class by comparing a letter of intent for a purchase versus a lease. And you're going to see the complexity of one versus the other. The class itself, I think we're going to probably limit it to like maybe 45 minutes or so. And we want to really kind of open it up to questions because I'm sure you guys have run into a lot of this issue. We get calls about that all the time. So I think that's the intent, is to try to keep it to 30, 45 minutes. Call it the art of the LOI and the contract. So we'll also touch on contracts a little bit and some pointers about once you get to a contract, what you should do as a broker. So again, this is our beautiful, when I had hair. I think it was contagious because about 12 months in, I started losing mine. So,
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So what is an LOI? So literally stands for letter of intent. Very simple, very basic. It's a intent, right? You go to a seller, you go to a buyer, you're like, hey, let's just put this letter together. You could honestly write a letter of intent on a back of a napkin. That's how simple it is. That's how simple you want it to be. The big thing that really matters is it's not binding, but it is good faith negotiations, right? You want to get down everything possible that you can possibly conceive of on this LOI. The better the LOI is, the simpler you have on the transaction. When you're talking about a lease, if it takes you 6 months to negotiate a lease, maybe if you negotiated better on the LOI, you could have cut that down to 3 or 4 months. So this is really where the battleground for the terms itself. If you miss something on the LOI and then it's last minute, late minute negotiations and a deal falls apart 6 months after, you just wasted a lot of time. So this is, I would say, the most important part of any contract, any sales process is going to be the LOI.
So we had a kind of a very basic timeline that is probably shared between whether you're pursuing a lease or a purchase. So obviously the inquiry comes first. You found the property and you've engaged, the buyer is wanting to engage with the seller. Then you submit an LOI. There's a negotiation period where you're essentially going back and forth on the general basic terms of what you want to agree on. On a lease, for example, that could be price per square foot, how long they're going to lease for, if there's going to be any TI, tenant improvement allowance from the landlord, so on and so forth. So they're basic terms that you're going to be negotiating on. Once you get past that, then you have the contract negotiation. That can take some time, and this is where you're going to bring in 99% of the time, you're going to bring in a lawyer, someone that you recommend, or if the buyer or the tenant has a lawyer on deck, the lawyer steps in and then assists with the contract negotiation. Feasibility period, if it's a purchase or a sale, you're generally going to have anywhere from 30 to, God knows, I mean, just depending on the contract, let's say 30 to 120 days in a feasibility study period, where the buyer gets to look at the property itself to see if it fits his needs. He can connect with the county to make sure that it's allowed by zoning, do an inspection of the property, you name it. And during this feasibility period timeline, the buyer can get back their deposit. These are like contingent, so like if you're doing a residential sale, if you have a financing contingency, the feasibility period is all the contingencies that are rolled into the contract. And then you go into closing, and there's a lot that goes into making sure that the deal closes properly there.
Well, one thing I'd like to add, so depending on where you are and who you're representing, so if you're representing the seller, you probably want to give the buyer that's submitting an offer your version of an LOI. That way they're kind of working off your template. So that's one item. The other item when it comes to to specifically like a feasibility study. When you have a general feasibility study, it's an easy in, easy out, right? You could be on day 120 of your feasibility study and you have 120-day feasibility and you could back out for any reason. If I'm on the seller side, I kind of want to negotiate the feasibility slightly differently. Maybe, hey, we have a 60-day appraisal feasibility. So I like to break down the feasibility differently depending on who I'm representing. If I'm representing a buyer, strong feasibility, 120 days, usually like no one catches that. On the seller side, I want to break it down and give them as few exits as possible later on. So on the LOI side, this is where it comes in. You do want to negotiate that up front. All right, so anatomy of a purchase LOI. And these things we're all going to get into in the case study, and you guys will see it, and this will be a much better, I think, overview of it. But real quick, so key components, you want to identify who the buyers are, who the sellers are. Anytime we have a buyer, we're always putting the buyer's name. If they have an LLC, we'll put the LLC as well, or in replacement of their personal name. However, I always add the term and or assignees. They could already have an LLC, but they might want to put it into a different LLC. Whatever the situation is, always add that language. It's going to help you. It's just going to save you a lot of headache later on. Now, if you're on the sell side, I would add, on the seller side, sorry, I would add personally for the buyer and or LLC is wholly owned by that buyer. I don't want that contract to be assigned and now it's a wholesale contract to random LLC or random person. So slight difference in language can change quite a bit. You want to identify the property. So what we like to do is put the address, put the parcel ID, put the land acreage, whatever identifying information we can put in the LOI, so that way there's no confusion about what we're selling. And sometimes you're selling land. Land can sometimes be hard to define. There's confusion in its history. So you really want to define it as well as possible so that it's accurate. Feasibility and closing timeline. This, again, just goes right down to the timeline of this contract. Again, it changes. We see a lot of 45-day feasibility, 15-day close, 60-day feasibility, 30-day close. That's a great contract. Again, it can go from anywhere from 30 days up to hundreds. We'll keep it at that. And then broker representation. So this is where we make sure that we put our information down there. We make sure that we put that as part of the negotiation or a commission or at least who's representing it. A lot of times commission is negotiated separately through a separate commission agreement. We like to have it there from the get-go, even if it's already been negotiated. That way we're just protecting ourselves on all sides. You want to go financial terms?
Yeah, so with a couple points about address and description of property. If you're negotiating a investment property and there's a tenant in there, I also like to include the tenant, especially if there's multiple tenants. We want to make sure that from the beginning there's no misunderstanding about this property that we're buying. We're buying it because Domino's is in there, for example. I always say this because this is actually going to come up later on. You want to put kind of the tenants that are in place there. But yeah, financial terms, obviously the price, your offer price. We say it, stated in numerical and written form, again, to avoid any confusion. Deposits is, you have a schedule of deposits. Sometimes it's as easy as you have an EMD of 50 grand and that's it. Sometimes on projects that are land-based or they're development-based, there's usually a schedule of deposits where after each contingency, or each kind of round of feasibility, the buyer is committing more. That usually goes hard. So let's say it's a $10 million piece of property. The buyer's committing $200,000 up front. Once that feasibility is over, a lot of times that EMD goes hard. The buyer keeps that if they don't back out before that period. And then there's usually a recommitment, especially if they want to extend feasibility another 30 days, 60 days, or what have you. So you'll see that, especially on more complicated deals, longer deals. Financing terms, you want to kind of, this depends. I mean, if you're on the buyer side, you don't want to get too granular about what we're financing with this bank at X rate, this and that. You'll keep it a little bit more open-ended, but a good seller broker, if you're on the buy side, a good seller broker is going to dig into the lender. It's probably going to have a conversation with them beforehand, and they'll know. It's a small world. If it's a lender that they've never heard of or something like that, that might kind of throw them off a little bit. So, but kind of break down what your financing terms are, how much they're putting down, and and the lender specifically. And we usually like to attach, especially if it's a competitive property, we like to tell a little bit more about the group that we're representing, if we're on the buy side, or the tenant. This is very important for tenants. You want to show off your client, just like when you do with a residential property. Proof of funds, a bio letter, a marketing deck if it's a company that you're representing, something about the group and how many locations they have and whatnot. All these things will go a long way in helping make a good impression with the seller or the landlord.
All right, so for a lease LOI, this is going to be the more complicated one. Yeah. Purchase LOIs are a lot simpler.
Just real quick. Yeah. I mean, you can see there's like what, four terms on each side, and the lease just gets way more
complicated. Actually, I would say this: you can sometimes get away with going straight to purchase straight to contract with a purchase. It's very hard to do that with a lease. Leases are just much more complicated. You just have so much more that you have to deal with. And that's why, going back to that bio, if you have a great client and they have a business plan, you want to attach that business plan. You know, at the end of the day, landlords are taking a huge risk on this tenant. Let's say it's a restaurant that's coming in. They don't want to take this risk, take the property off the market, have them in the space for years, only for them to fail or, do rent abatement, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a much heavier investment for landlords and also tenants at the same time. So you really want to make sure that they're qualified. But going back to the LOI, so again, you want to identify who the players are. So you want to identify the tenant, you want to identify the landlord, you want to talk about the use. Now this is very important because it also plays into exclusivity, which is later down a little bit. But if you have a pizza restaurant, you want to clarify that it's a pizza restaurant. You don't want to clarify that, oh, hey, it's just a general restaurant. What happens is you might be in a shopping center with a Domino's already. Domino's is not going to let you do any other pizza. However, sometimes if it's dine-in pizza, they'll allow that. So you really want to dig into this, and this is something that if you are representing a tenant, you want to be very clear and upfront with what they have. We've had situations where, hey, I'm going to open up a grocery store, and then, hey, I want to add in a butcher, and then, hey, I want to add in a bakery, and hey, I want to do this. It really changes the terms, and it's just like these bombshells that keep getting dropped throughout the process in a very complicated process. And sometimes leases for small spaces are not even worth it. So you really want to make sure that all this legwork is done up front. Square footage, specify the rentable area. Sometimes you want to get this verified yourself. You don't want to go based off the numbers that the landlord has given you or the listing agent. Our first ever deal that we did as a lease, there was a discrepancy of 200 square feet, which is huge because you're paying by the square foot. So that's one of the big due diligence items that you definitely want to verify. But you want to put the square footage there. We always put kind of approximate. That way, if it's off by a couple square feet, it's fine. So we'll put plus or minus 1,800 square feet, knowing full well for the LOI, that's an approximation. For the contract, you want to have the exact square footage. You want to outline the lease duration. So leases can go anywhere from 2 years to 10 years. Duration is also going to include any potential renewals. And that's an option to renew that only the tenant can exercise. That right can't be taken away from them. So if you have a daycare, for example, they don't want to do a 5-year lease. They want to do a 10-year lease with 2 5-year options to renew. They want to be in this place long term. So you really want to identify not only the initial term, but any renewal terms as well. Personal versus corporate guarantee.
Rent versus lease commencement.
Oh, sorry. Rent versus lease commencement. So this is probably one of the biggest misconceptions that people have. I might sign a lease today. All right, and we get into this space. I've signed it. However, I don't start paying actual rent until the lease commencement date. So there's we also have other things. We'll keep that for the financial terms. But the day that you sign the lease, that's when you're ratified. The day that you actually start paying rent, or actually potentially you get possession of the property, that's when the lease commencement is. Now we go to personal versus corporate guarantee. If you it's basically what it sounds like. Either I'm personally guaranteeing the property with my assets, or if I have 5 restaurants, I'm going to get away with a corporate guarantee. I don't have to put my assets on the line fully and wholly. And the last one, landlord versus tenant maintenance repair responsibilities. So if you guys have ever heard of triple net lease, Landlords love that because they have zero responsibility. Sometimes you'll hear it as an absolute triple net. Office space, you'll a lot of times hear a gross, it's a gross lease, but so the landlord will still take care of maintenance, they'll take care of custodial services, they'll take care of parking lot. So the less responsibility the landlord has, the better for them, and vice versa. So what's a tenant required to do to upkeep the place, and what's the landlord's responsibilities? This is probably one of the largest, I would say one of the biggest issues that it creates issues in the future if this is not defined correctly. So those are key components, and then we also have the financial terms.
Yeah, so the quick clarification on rent versus lease commencement. So very simply, lease commencement is when you're signing and they're getting possession. Rent commencement is when they start paying rent. So the reason why there's a discrepancy there is, like, if you're building out a restaurant, you're not going to start paying rent on a property that's not performing yet, that's not bringing in clients yet. You're going to negotiate, if you're a good tenant broker, you're going to negotiate upwards of a year for them to get their build out, depending on the condition of the space. So that's why there's a lease commencement date where they're actually grabbing, they're sending in their security deposit and their first month's check, and then they're grabbing the keys for the space and getting to work. And then a rent commencement is when their actual rent starts. And then we're going to get into here rent schedule and abatement, and these are tied together. So a rent schedule is going to be the structure of your rent payment. So when the first payment starts, right? So this rolls into your rent versus the lease commencement dates. But the abatement can start, so your rent starts, let's say you've negotiated 6 months for a build out period. So your lease commences today, you've negotiated 6 months for build out, your rent doesn't commence until month 6 or month 7, right? You can negotiate rent abatement even past that, 100% or 50% or 75%, depending on how strong of a negotiation you have. So even if rent commences today, you can still have a rent abatement period of 100% rent abatement for like another 6 months. So it can get a little bit, you want to make sure you're really clear about these terms, because you might think, okay, well, I have 12 months of free rent. You do, but actually rent commenced at this date, even though if it was abated 100% for 6 months. And we'll go through that once we kind of go through that case study. TI term, so this is tenant improvement allowance, extremely important, and this is one of the battlegrounds on an LOI or a lease in general. The tenant wants help from the landlord to do their build out. They're improving their space, and the landlord doesn't want to give any money out. So they usually understand that there's a happy middle ground. So a lot of times, a professional landlord will actually have attached with their offer, hey, we know this project is going to cost you $150 a square foot to build out. We're going to offer you $40 a square foot. They're going to come in a little low, and then it's your job to kind of try to bring it up to a happy medium for your tenant. So those you really want to be very, very particular about. TI isn't paid back until after they open for business. So a lot of tenants, and we've had this happen where we've negotiated for months, and the tenant the whole time is thinking, I'm going to get that landlord TI allowance up front. Like, no, you're going to get that paid after you open for business. So don't take that for granted. Explain that very well to your tenant clients, that's going to be a rebate. It's not going to be something that you're going to take up front. Don't count on that for your funds. Escalations is also very important. A lot of times, the number that you'll see a lot is 3%. It's not a fixed thing, every landlord's, but that's just kind of what you'll see a lot, 2.5% to 3%. This is what it escalates, what the rent escalates every single year per square foot. So if you're paying $30 a square foot today, it's going to be 3% escalated next year. And then year 3 is going to be 3% of year 2, so on and so forth. This is very important to get right because it rolls into your commission. If you're getting paid a 4% commission on a lease, and it's a 10-year lease with 3% escalations, do yourself a favor, plug it into ChatGPT. Just the base terms. This is how much I'm getting paid per square foot. This is how big the place is for 10 years with 3% escalation. It does a whole calculation for you. Triple net. Here you break down what their triple nets are, right? So triple nets are your property tax, your insurance, and your common area maintenance. It's really good to have an understanding up front because a lot of landlords might not give you what the costs are. They'll just say plus triple net. Get an idea because to your tenant client, they want to know what they're paying per month. They don't really care whether it's base or net. They just want to know, hey, look, what's my total all in? Make sure you get this number up front and don't let it kind of sit until the end. Renewal period, yeah, so there's, like Khalid mentioned, so there are options to renew, usually done on a 5-year basis, especially on retail leases, but you'll see them all over. Sometimes they renew once a year, sometimes every 3 years. These are unilateral renewals, generally speaking, where the landlord doesn't have a say. If the tenant wants to renew, then that's their option. If they don't, they want to leave, that's their option as well. But these are stipulated as well. So sometimes they'll say, well, if you want to renew in 10 years, we're not going to do it at 3% escalation. We're going to do it at the market rate then. So it's essentially going to reset their rent schedule, right? They don't want to renew at 3% if the market's now at $100 a square foot and you've been paying, $55 a square foot. So a smart landlord will roll that in there.
I would say, and this is where a lot of strategy comes in. So if you have an industrial property, for example, you'll see a lot of short-term leases now, like 3-year leases. The reason that the landlord is doing that, they don't want to lock up their lease right now for 5 or 10 years with 2 to 3% escalations when they know in 3 years the market is supposed to 3x. So they'll get a tenant in for a short term, they'll do standard rent escalations, and then they'll renew at market rate. So knowing the market, knowing kind of what's happening, the forecast, the demand and supply, it really does play a role in every single one of these financial factors.
Absolutely. Requested, this is like very important. This is for you. Everything we've been focused on is how for you to be a good tenant rep. This is you protecting yourself as a tenant rep. Make sure that your commission is, and ask for as much as you want. In commercial, everything is negotiable within reason, but try to shoot for a little bit higher and land, somewhere that makes sense. But you want that commission agreement, especially on a lease. There's a separate commission agreement that the landlord signs. And then after the lease is signed, there's an invoice for that first part of that commission. So these things you really want to make sure you get right. If one of these falls through the crack, the landlord can be like, well, I don't have a signed commission agreement from you, even though you and the broker have been discussing this and it's 3%. Just make sure you get this signed with the LOI.